The last tour train left the South Rim at 4:52 in the afternoon, and I was the only person on the platform who noticed the driver's cab was empty. 41 passengers had already boarded. I could see them through the smudged windows, families settling into the vintage green seats, a kid pressing his face to the glass, an old man folding a park map. The horn had already sounded twice, and in the front car, where a man named Delph should have been sitting with his hand on the throttle, there was nothing, just an empty seat, a hanging jacket, and a coffee cup still steaming on the dash. I know trains. I ran maintenance on the Grand Canyon Railway line for 19 years before I moved to the depot side. A train does not pull out of a station by itself. The dead man's pedal doesn't allow it. Somebody has to be pushing that lever with their own body weight. And yet the wheels were already turning, slow and patient, iron grinding on iron, pulling 41 people north into the pines toward Williams. I ran. I actually ran, 61 years old with a bad left knee, down the length of that platform waving my arms, and nobody inside so much as looked up. Then I saw why the driver's seat was empty. I saw what was standing at the rear of the last car, pressed against the door glass from the inside. And I understood that this train wasn't leaving without a driver by accident. Before I go on, let me just say thank you. To everyone who keeps coming back for these stories, and to you if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm glad you found us. If this kind of story is what you come looking for, stay with the channel, leave a comment, and settle in. Now let me tell you exactly what I saw pressed against that glass. It was Delph, the driver, and he was on the wrong side of the door. My name is Halloran Pike. Everybody at the depot just called me Pike, and by that afternoon in late September, there were only 14 of us left working the line, down from over 200. I'd like to tell you the collapse came like they show it in the movies, all at once. Sirens and helicopters, and the whole world going dark in a single night. It didn't. It came the way water gets into an old roof. Slow, then a stain on the ceiling, then one morning the whole thing comes down on your kitchen table. The sickness, nobody at the depot ever settled on a name for it. We just called it the Gray, because of what it did to the eyes of. He had reached northern Arizona about 6 weeks before that train pulled out. It came up from Phoenix, along the interstate, the way everything comes to the canyon, in cars full of tourists who didn't know yet what they were carrying. By the time the Park Service tried to close the South Rim entrance, it was already inside. You can't quarantine a place that 4,000 people wander through every single day. I stayed because I had nowhere better to be, and because the railway was the only thing I'd ever done well. My wife Delia passed 4 years back, cancer, and my daughter lived up in Flagstaff and had stopped answering the radio 9 days before that afternoon. 9 days. I counted every one of them, so when the park superintendent, a hard woman named Ruth Anchetta, said she needed men who understood the rolling stock, I put my hand up. There wasn't much of a decision in it. A man my age either stays useful or he sits down and waits. Here's what you need to understand about where we were. The Grand Canyon Railway is a real working line. 65 miles of single track running from Williams up to the South Rim Depot, through the Ponderosa Forest and the high desert grassland. In normal times, it hauled tourists up in the morning and back down in the afternoon. An old-fashioned excursion, brass and wood, and a fellow in a vest telling jokes. But that track was also, by late September, the only reliable way in or out of the rim that didn't go through the choke points on Highway 64. And the choke points on 64 had become places you did not go. The idea was simple, and it was Ruth's. We had close to 200 people sheltering at the South Rim Park staff, stranded visitors, a handful of families who'd walked in off the trails. We couldn't feed them. The rim had no farmland, no supply, nothing but a few restaurant freezers already going soft. Williams had a rail yard, a grain co-op, a hospital with a walled parking structure, and most important, it had a National Guard staging point that was still answering the radio, still holding a perimeter. So we would run the train. Not for tourists, for evacuation. 40 at a time, the most we could safely load and defend. Down the 65 miles to Williams, unload, and bring the empty consist back up for the next group. That afternoon's run was the 7th. 6 trains had already made it down clean. I had helped load every one of them. I knew the drill the way you know the walk from your bed to your bathroom in the dark. Delph Cassaway was our best driver. 52, quiet. A Navajo man from Tuba City who'd worked the line even longer than I had, and who never wasted a word when a nod would do. He had a way of bringing a locomotive to a stop so gentle you'd hardly feel it. And in the last 6 weeks, he'd become something close to a friend, mostly because neither of us needed to fill silences. He had a daughter too, grown, somewhere down in Winslow. And he'd stopped talking about her the same way I'd stopped talking about mine. We understood each other on that. So when I say I saw Delph pressed against the glass of the last car on the wrong side of a locked door, while the train he was supposed to be driving pulled out with no hand on the throttle, you understand why my whole body went cold. Let me back up 20 minutes, because the 20 minutes before that train left is where the real story lives. We loaded that 7th group at 4:15. It was a bad afternoon to run. There'd been a commotion at the west end of the village around noon. A knot of the gray coming in off the Hermit Road. And the guardsmen, we still had 6 of them, under a sergeant named Okonkwo, had spent the whole day pushing them back and burning through ammunition we couldn't replace. Everybody was afraid. Ruth wanted the train gone before dark, because after dark, the whole equation changed. The gray moved differently at night. Faster isn't the word. More sure of themselves. Like they stopped bumping into things. The loading itself went the way it always did, which is to say it went badly, and we managed it anyway. 41 souls. One more than the limit, because a woman named Corinne Vasquez had a grandson, and I wasn't going to be the man who split them up over a head count. I checked them aboard against Ruth's list, called the numbers to Delph through the open cab window, watched him mark them off on his own card. Standard. We double-counted everything in those days, because a mistake with the gray didn't give you a second chance. The man I need to tell you about was already on the platform when we started loading. His name was Errol Stane, and I want to be careful and fair about him, because it would be easy to paint him as a devil from the first line, and that isn't how it was. If it had been that simple, I'd have seen it coming, and I didn't. None of us did. Stane had come in off the Bright Angel Trail about 3 weeks earlier, part of a backpacking group that got caught below the rim when everything fell apart. The others in his group had all died or vanished. He came up alone, sunburned and 30 pounds lighter than his own belt, and Ruth took him in the way she took everybody in. He was maybe 45, lean, with a soft voice and careful hands, and the kind of manner that made people trust him fast. He said he'd been a paramedic in Sacramento. He knew wounds, he knew fevers, he could set a bone. And in a place with 200 frightened people and no doctor, that made him valuable. Within a week, he was running our little clinic out of the old ticket office. I liked him. That's the truth, and I'll own it. He was gentle with the kids and patient with the old folks, and he'd sit up all night with somebody who was scared. When my knee locked up loading the 4th train, it was Stane who wrapped it and told me which way to sleep on it. He remembered things about people. He remembered that Delia had passed, remembered her name, asked after my daughter in Flagstaff by name. That kind of attention is rare, and it lands hard on a lonely man. And I was a lonely man. So when Stane came to me on the platform that afternoon, while we were loading, and told me quiet and grave that Delph had been acting strange, I listened. "He's not right, Pike," Stane said. He had a way of standing close and dropping his voice so it felt like you were the only person in the world he trusted. "I checked him an hour ago. His temperature's up. His hands are shaking. I don't want to say it out loud where the passengers hear, but I've seen the early stage a dozen times now. The shaking, the sensitivity to light. He wouldn't let me look at his eyes. I felt the platform tilt a little under me. You think he's turning?" "I think there's a real chance," Stane said. "And I think we've got 41 people about to get sealed into a train with him at the controls for 2 hours. You know what happens in a closed car if one of them goes." I did know. We all knew. It was the nightmare we ran the trains specifically to avoid, the sealed space, the panic, the way it moved through a crowd. 6 weeks had taught us that the gray needed contact, a bite or blood in a wound. But it also taught us that in a locked car full of frightened people, contact was only a matter of time. "He drove the last run 3 days ago," I said. "He was fine. 3 days is a long time now." Stane put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I saw, because you're the one who knows the train. If he goes wrong at 40 miles an hour on that grade, you lose everybody. I couldn't carry that if I said nothing. Here is the thing I've gone over 10,000 times since. Everything Stane said was plausible. Every word of it fit what we knew. And I had watched Delph mark that head count card an hour before. And yes, his hand had trembled, and yes, he'd kept his hat brim low. And yes, when I'd offered him coffee, he'd said his eyes were bothering him from the smoke off the West End. Every one of those things had a normal explanation, and every one of them also fit what Stane described. That's how a good lie works. It doesn't fight the truth. It walks alongside it. I went to Delph. I want you to know I went to him honest, not as an accuser, but as a friend. I climbed up into the cab, and I closed the window so the passengers couldn't hear, and I said, "Delph, talk to me straight. How are you feeling?" He looked at me for a long moment. The smoke haze was coming through the cab, that resinous burn of ponderosa, and the light through it was orange and strange. His eyes, when he finally tipped his hat back, were red-rimmed and watering. But they weren't gray. I looked hard, and they weren't gray. Not the milk-white creep we'd all learned to watch for. "I'm tired, Pike," he said. "I'm tired down in my bones. My hands don't want to hold still. I think it's just everything." He rubbed his face. "You ever get so tired the shaking starts? Your eyes are watering. Smoke's been in them all day." He said it flat, then quieter. "Stane already talked to you?" The question sat between us. I should have paid more attention to it. I should have asked myself why a man, supposedly too sick to know his own name, would be tracking who Stane had spoken to. But I was tired too, and there were 41 people behind me, and Ruth was on the platform tapping her watch. "He's worried about you," I said. Delph laughed once, without any humor in it at all. "Yeah," he said. "I bet he is." And he turned back to his controls and would not say another word. If you've ever had to make a call about somebody's health when you weren't a doctor and the cost of being wrong was other people's lives, tell me in the comments how you'd have played it, because I've never once been sure I got it right. I climbed down, and I found Ruth, and I told her what Stane had told me. And that decision to carry Stane's words to Ruth instead of trusting my own eyes on my own friend was the first domino. The rest of what happened, all of it, fell out of that one moment on the platform in the orange smoke. Ruth Anchetta was not a woman who dithered. She'd run backcountry rescue for 2 decades before she ran the park, and she made hard calls fast and lived with them. She heard me out, her jaw working. And then she said, "We can't send Delph, not on a maybe. Get him off the train." "And who drives?" I said. "You've got me and you've got Delph, and that's the whole roster who can handle that consist on the grade. Everybody else is dead or down in Williams." She looked at me a long moment. "Then it's you, Pike." I hadn't driven a train in 11 years. I'd run maintenance. I'd relieved a driver on a flat stretch once or twice. But I hadn't taken a full consist down that grade with a load of people since before Delia got sick. I opened my mouth to say all of that, and Ruth just held up a hand. "You know the line better than anyone alive," she said. "You know every foot of it. You'll be fine on the flat, and you'll be careful on the grade, because you're a careful man. I'd rather have a rusty driver I trust than a good one who might go." And here's where Stane did the thing I didn't understand until much later. He was right there, at my elbow, helpful as ever. And he said, "I'll ride down with you, Pike, in case anybody on board has trouble. Medical's my job." Ruth nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. Of course, the paramedic rides the evac train. He'd ridden 2 of the earlier ones. Nobody thought a thing of it. So the plan, in the space of about 4 minutes, went from Delph driving alone to me driving with Stane aboard as medical support, and Delph pulled off entirely. Delph didn't fight it. That was the part that fooled me most of all. He climbed down out of that cab slow and stiff, and he handed me his head count card, and he said, "Watch the throttle on the Coconino grade. She pulls left when she's loaded." And then, so quiet I almost missed it, with his hand still on the card as I took it. "Pike, don't let him near the radio." I thought he meant he was rambling, a tired, sick man talking nonsense. I took the card, and I said something to soothe him, and I turned to my work. And Delph Cassaway walked back toward the depot buildings, and that was the last I saw of him until he was on the wrong side of that glass. Now I'll tell you what I did not know at 4:15 that afternoon. The things I only pieced together later, because you deserve to understand the shape of the trap, even if I was standing inside it blind. Errol Stane was not a paramedic from Sacramento. There was a real Errol Stane, and he probably had been a paramedic, and I have a fairly good guess about what happened to him below the rim. The man who came up the Bright Angel Trail wearing his name and carrying his ID had walked into that backpacking group as a stranger somewhere down in the canyon, and walked out as its only survivor. I don't know for certain what he was before. A man who could talk his way into anything, who read people the way I read a rail joint, who understood that in a collapse, the most valuable skill in the world is being the person everyone trusts. He'd spent 3 weeks making himself indispensable, learning our stores, our roster, our routes, our radio protocols, learning, most of all, exactly how the evacuation train worked and where it would take him. Because here's what none of us had let ourselves think about too hard. The trains only ran one way that mattered. Down to Williams, where the guard held a perimeter, where there was food and walls and a working hospital and, we were fairly sure, a route further out to somewhere safe. The rim was a dead end. Everyone up there was going to have to be evacuated, 40 at a time, and there were 200 of us, and the trains could only run so many times before dark, and before the fuel ran low, and before the gray finally overran the platform. Simple arithmetic. Not everyone was getting out. Some group of us was going to be standing on that platform when the last train left, and there was no coming back for us. Stane had done that arithmetic weeks before any of the rest of us dared to. And he had decided, coldly and early, that he was going to be on a train and not on the platform. Being the medic got him a seat. But a seat wasn't enough for a man like Stane. He wanted a guarantee. And the way to guarantee your own passage out of a dying place is to make sure the machine that gets you out never comes back to take anyone else's turn. He wanted the last train, not to be on it, to be the reason there was no next one. But I didn't know any of that at 4:15. At 4:15, I was a rusty old man climbing into a driver's seat I hadn't sat in for 11 years. With 41 people behind me and a smoke-orange sky and a friend's strange warning ringing in my ears. Don't let him near the radio, and no idea in the world what it meant. Let me tell you about the cab and the radio, because the radio is the whole thing, and if you don't understand it, none of the rest will hit you the way it hit me. The locomotive we ran was an old diesel-electric, a workhorse from the 50s that the railway had kept running out of pride as much as anything. It had a proper cab, gauges you could read, a throttle with 8 notches, an independent brake and a train brake, and a dead man's pedal that had to stay depressed or the whole train would go into emergency stop. That pedal is important. Remember it. And bolted to the console, patched in by our own people over the last 6 weeks, was a field radio, a real one. A guard issue set with the range to reach Williams the whole 65 miles down the line. That radio was the nervous system of the entire evacuation. Here's why. The guard perimeter at Williams had a fence line and a gate, and the gate was kept sealed except when a train was inbound, because an open gate is an invitation to the gray. The protocol was ironclad. The train radioed ahead at 3 fixed points, a call at the start, a call at the halfway water tower, and a final call at a marker called the Anita siding, 6 miles out, which triggered the guard to open the perimeter gate and prep the receiving platform. No final call, no open gate. And the perimeter at Williams was on a rolling timer that we'd worked out over 6 runs. From the moment they opened that gate to receive a train, they could only hold it open a hard window before the accumulated gray at their fence line made it untenable, and they had to seal up again. Train or no train, roughly 40 minutes. Miss your window, and you arrived at a sealed perimeter with 100 of the gray following your headlamp in the dark and nowhere to go. 3 calls. Start, middle, Anita siding. Miss the last one, and the gate that means life stays shut. You see now why Delph's warning was the only thing that mattered, and why I was too dull that afternoon to hear it. We pulled out at 4:52. Except we didn't, or we shouldn't have, because I wasn't in the seat yet. Here is exactly how it went, and I've reconstructed it so many times I could walk you through it second by second. At about 4:48, I was still on the platform doing the final walk of the cars, checking the door seals, the way I'd done on every run. Standard. The driver doesn't board until the walk is done and the conductor gives the all clear. That afternoon there was no conductor to speak of, just me and Stane and Ruth's people, so I did the walk myself. And Stane offered helpfully, always helpfully, to sit in the cab and mind the passengers through the front window while I finished. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was alone in that cab for maybe 90 seconds. That's all it took. I was at the rear of the last car when I heard the horn sound the 3rd time, which was not the signal. And then I heard the compressor kick and felt through the soles of my boots the particular shudder of a train coming off its brakes. I turned around, and the wheels were already moving. And I understood in one horrible instant what a man could do to that dead man's pedal in 90 seconds if he understood the machine. You can defeat it. You can wedge it. A folded jacket, a wad of webbing, a wrench laid just so anything that holds the pedal down fools the train into thinking a living driver's foot is on it. The train will run wide open on a defeated dead man's pedal until something stops it. And Stane, who had spent 3 weeks learning everything, had learned that too. He'd started the train, and then he'd stepped off it. And I saw him. I turned, and I saw Errol Stane standing on the platform in the orange light, perfectly calm, watching the train he'd started roll away from him. And for one confused second, I thought, good, he got off, he's safe. And then the whole thing turned over in my head like a rail car going off its trucks. And I understood that he was exactly where he wanted to be. On the ground, on the rim. Watching the evacuation train leave with no driver, 41 people aboard. And me, the only other person who could run that consist, sprinting down the platform on a bad knee. Already too far back to reach the cab. That's when I saw Delph. He was at the rear door of the last car, on the inside, pounding on the glass. Stane had put him there. I learned the details later, but the shape of it was this. Sometime in the hour before departure, Stane had gotten Delph alone, probably on the pretext of a medical check, the very sickness he'd invented for him. And he'd locked him into the rear vestibule of the last car. A little steel closet of a space with a door that sealed from the outside. Delph wasn't sick. Delph had never been sick. Delph was the one man besides me who could have stopped this, and so Stane had gotten him out of the driver's seat with a lie whispered in my ear, and then sealed him in the back of the very train he'd been meant to drive. The train was leaving without a driver because the man who was supposed to drive it was trapped in the last car, and the man who should have been in the cab, me, was standing on the platform watching it go. I did the only thing left to do. I ran for the last car, and I caught the grab iron of the rear vestibule with both hands, and I hauled myself up onto the step as the platform slid away beneath me. And my knee screamed, and my shoulder near came out of its socket, but I got up, 61 years old, and I got up onto a moving train because the alternative was watching 41 people die. The last thing I saw of the South Rim was Errol Stane standing alone on the empty platform, and Ruth Anchetta running toward him, and Stane raising both hands the way an innocent man does, already spinning whatever story would keep him alive up there for one more day. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He'd gotten what he wanted. The train was gone and it wasn't coming back. And whatever happened to the 200 people still on that rim, he'd made sure he wasn't going to be crushed in the panic of the final loading. He'd made his own train. He'd made it out of 41 strangers and one friend of mine, and one rusty old fool on the back step. The rear door was locked from the outside, and Delph was on the inside of it, and I was on the outside on a step over the rushing gravel. And the train was accelerating down the line with nobody at the throttle. I want to tell you what it's like to be on the outside step of a moving train, working a locked door with your fingers while the ground blurs by underneath. The wind pulls at you. The car rocks. Every joint in the rail sends a jolt up through your feet that tries to shake your grip loose. I had one hand locked on the grab iron and one hand on the door mechanism, and Delph's face was 6 inches from mine through the glass, and neither of us could hear the other over the roar. The rear vestibule door had a manual override, a lever behind a little steel plate meant for emergencies, and I knew where it was because I'd maintained these cars for 2 decades. Stane had locked the main mechanism, but he hadn't known about the override, or hadn't had time. I got the plate open with my thumbnail bleeding, and I threw the lever, and the door gave, and I half fell into the vestibule on top of Delph, as the train hit the first real curve. For a second, we just lay there in that little steel space, both of us breathing like we'd run the whole 65 miles. "He locked me in," Delph said. His voice was raw. Told me he wanted to check my temperature away from the passengers. Soon as the door shut, I heard the bolt go. I've been in here 20 minutes. Pike, there's nobody driving. I know. There's nobody driving. I know, Delph. Get up. We've got maybe 2 minutes before the Coconino grade, and if we hit it wide open with a jammed pedal, we go off the rail. That got him up. We went through the cars at a run. 41 faces turning to us. That particular question forming on all of them at once. Why are the 2 railwaymen running toward the front? And I didn't stop to answer any of it. Corinne Vasquez caught my sleeve as I passed, her grandson asleep against her. And I just said, "Stay in your seats and hold on to something," and kept moving. Because the truth was worse than anything they could imagine, and there was no time to soften it. We came into the cab, and it was exactly as I'd feared. Stane had jammed the dead man's pedal with his own folded jacket, wedged tight, a note, and he'd run the throttle up to notch 6 and left it. The train was doing better than 40 on a stretch that fed directly into the steepest downgrade on the whole line, the Coconino grade, where the track dropped through a series of cuts and the rail pulled hard to the left under a heavy load, exactly as Delph had warned me an hour before, when I still thought he was the sick one. Delph got the pedal cleared, and I got my hands on the brakes. And between the 2 of us, we brought that consist down off the throttle and onto the independent brake and held her, feathering it the way you have to on a grade so you don't lock the wheels and lose all your control at once. Delph took the driver's seat because Delph was the driver, always had been. And I stood at his shoulder and called the grade to him from memory, every cut and curve, because I'd walked that track on foot 100 times inspecting rail. We got her down the Coconino grade at a crawl, both of us sweating through our shirts. And at the bottom, where the line flattened out toward the halfway water tower, we finally let her run again at a safe speed, and I let myself breathe. And that's when I looked at the radio. And I understood what "don't let him near the radio" had meant. The radio was gone. Not broken, gone. Stane had pulled it out of its mount in those 90 seconds in the cab, ripped the leads and taken the whole set with him when he stepped off onto the platform. There was a bright square of clean metal where it had sat, and 4 bare wire ends, and nothing else. I stood there, looking at those 4 wires, and I felt the floor of the whole situation drop out from under me. Worse than the grade, worse than the locked door. Because remember the protocol. 3 radio calls. Start, middle, Anita siding. And the perimeter gate at Williams stays sealed until that final call comes in from the Anita siding. And then it opens on a hard timer, and it can only stay open so long before the gray at the fence force it shut again. No call, no open gate. And we were doing 65 miles toward a walled perimeter that had no idea we were coming. That would not open for us. That could not open for us without warning. Because opening blind meant letting the gray in on top of their own people. Stane hadn't just marooned 200 people on the rim. He'd made sure this train, the one he wasn't on, the one carrying the people whose seats he'd needed emptied, arrived at Williams to a sealed gate in the dark with 100 of the gray drawn to our lights and no way in. He'd killed us, going as thoroughly as he'd killed the ones he left behind. He hadn't wanted witnesses, and he hadn't wanted a train that could come back. Take the radio, and both problems solve themselves at once. 65 miles down the line, where he'd never have to watch. How long till they close the day window at the yard? I asked Delph. He didn't take his eyes off the track. Delph never wasted a word. But I watched him do the same arithmetic I was doing, and I saw his jaw tighten. They hold the receiving protocol till full dark, he said. After dark, no gate opens for anybody, radio call or not. Standing order. Too many of the gray at the fence after dark. He glanced at the sky through the smoke, that orange going to bruise purple at the edges. We've got maybe 50 minutes of usable light. It's a 2-hour run at safe speed. 50 minutes of light. 2 hours of track, no radio. A sealed gate at the end that would not open for a train it couldn't hear coming, and that after dark would not open at all. If you were standing in that cab, looking at 4 bare wires where the only thing that could open the gate used to be, tell me what you'd do, because I stood there for a good 10 seconds, and my mind gave me absolutely nothing. Then Delph said the thing that started the real fight to survive. "The water tower," he said. "Halfway point. There's a maintenance line side phone." I'd forgotten it. Of course I'd forgotten it. In 19 years of maintenance, I'd used the line side phones maybe twice. Because who calls them? They were relics. Hard-wired copper telephones mounted in weatherproof boxes at the water tower and a couple of other points. Part of the original signaling system from decades back. They didn't reach Williams. They only reached the next box down the line and the dispatch shack that nobody had manned in months. Useless for calling ahead. But Delph wasn't thinking about calling ahead. Delph was thinking about the one thing I'd let myself forget in the panic. That a copper line-side phone runs on its own wire, strung on poles along the whole right-of-way. And that wire went all the way down to the Williams yard, into the old dispatch shack, which sat inside the guard perimeter. "If anybody's within earshot of the dispatch shack down there," Delph said, "the line-side phone rings straight through to it. Doesn't need the radio. Doesn't need a tower. It's just copper, and it's been hanging on those poles for 60 years. He finally looked at me. "It's a long shot, Pike. That shack's been dark for months. But it's a call we can make from the water tower without stopping at Williams. And it's the only one we've got." The water tower was the halfway point. 30-some miles down, call it 50 minutes at safe speed on the flat, which meant we'd reach it right around the time the light died. We ran for it. I need to tell you about the passengers now, because 41 people don't sit quietly while 2 railwaymen sprint back and forth and rip open panels and argue over a dead radio. They knew something was wrong. Word had gone through the cars the way it does, and by the time we'd been running 20 minutes, there was a low current of fear moving through those green vintage seats that was its own kind of danger. Because fear in a closed train is exactly the thing the evacuation was designed to prevent. I went back through the cars myself while Delph drove, because somebody had to, and because I've learned that the worst thing you can do with frightened people is leave them to invent their own version of the truth. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't tell them a man had marooned them on purpose. I told them the radio had failed, which was true, and that we had a plan to reach Williams another way, which was also true. And that I needed them calm, and I needed them in their seats, because we might have to move fast at the end. There was a retired school teacher named Bertram Ochoa, who took it on himself to keep the front car steady. An old man with a voice that carried, and he started getting people to talk about where they were headed, who they were trying to reach in Williams, ordinary things, and it worked better than anything I could have done. There was Corinne and her grandson, a boy of about 7 named Teo, who had slept through the whole grade and woke up asking if we were there yet. There was a young couple, Wren and the man, whose name I never got, who held hands the entire way and said nothing to anyone. 41 people, and every single one of them was a person Stane had done arithmetic on and decided was worth less than his own guaranteed seat. That thought kept me moving when the knee wanted to quit. We reached the water tower as the last real light was going out of the sky. I want to slow down here, because these next minutes were the hinge of everything. Delph brought the train to a stop alongside the water tower, gentle as ever, even in a crisis. And the plan was simple. I'd drop down, run to the line-side phone box, ring the dispatch shack at Williams, and pray to God somebody was near enough to hear a copper phone ring in a building that had been dark for months. If someone answered, I'd tell them a train was inbound with no radio and beg them to hold the gate. If no one answered, we'd have burned 10 minutes of the dark we didn't have, and we'd run for Williams anyway and take our chances on a sealed gate. But the moment the train stopped, I understood there was a second problem, and it was standing out there in the dusk between me and the phone box. The gray had found the water tower. Not many, 6, maybe 8, drifting in the grassland around the base of the tower, drawn by God knows what, the water, the old smell of people, or maybe just the way they always seemed to drift toward the structures men built. In daylight, 6 of them at a distance would have been a problem I could manage. But the light was going, and I told you what the dark does to them, how they stop bumping into things, how they get sure. And the phone box was on the far side of the tower, 70 or 80 yards across open ground, past all of them. Delph saw them the same moment I did. "Don't," he said. "Not in this light. We'll run for Williams and take the gate cold." "The gate won't open for a train it can't hear," I said. "You said it yourself. After dark, no gate for anybody. This phone is it, Delph. This is the whole thing. Then I'll go and you drive. You're the only driver we've got who can bring this consist into a hot yard with the gray on our tail. I'm the one who can be spared." I said it plain, and it landed plain, because it was true, and we both knew it was true. And there's a certain peace in saying the true thing out loud in a moment like that. You keep her ready to roll the second I'm back on the step. If I don't make it back in 5 minutes, you go without me, and you run her straight through to Williams, and you find some other way through that gate. You hear me? You do not wait past 5 minutes with 41 people aboard for one old man." Delph looked at me for a long second, and then he did something he'd never done in 6 weeks. He reached out and gripped my forearm, hard, the way you grip a man you're not sure you'll see again. "Pike," he said, "watch your left. They pull left too." It was the same thing he'd told me about the throttle on the grade, turned into a blessing, and I have never forgotten it. I went down the ladder into the dusk. Let me tell you how you cross 80 yards of open ground past the gray when the light is dying. You don't run in a straight line, because a straight line is a sound and a rhythm, and they lock onto rhythm. You move in stops and starts. You use the tower legs and the old pump housing for cover. You keep your feet quiet on the gravel, and you breathe through your mouth so they don't hear you gasp. I'd learned all of this in 6 weeks, the way you learn anything when the price of not learning it is your life. I moved like a man 20 years younger and 40 pounds lighter, and I made it to the near tower leg with all of them still drifting. None of them turned my way. The phone box was 30 yards on, past 2 of them. I waited. I timed their drift. And when the nearest one had turned its back and gone still, they go still sometimes, just stop like a machine idling. I went, low and fast, and I reached the box and got it open and lifted the old copper handset off its hook. It was dead. No dial tone, no hum, nothing. Just the flat silence of a dead line, and my own heartbeat filling it. I stood there with a dead phone against my ear. An 8 of the gray drifting between me and a train I had 5 minutes to get back to. And I understood that Stane had thought of this too, or the years had thought of it for him. Because a copper line strung on 60-year-old poles through miles of forest and grassland doesn't need a saboteur to fail. A fallen tree, a rotted pole, a single break anywhere in 30 miles of wire and the whole line goes dead. And I would never know where. But the box wasn't just a phone. I remembered standing there in the dark with the dead handset, that these old line-side boxes had one more thing in them. A relay. Part of the original block signaling. And connected to that relay, on this stretch, was the water tower's own beacon. A light meant to warn crews the tower was occupied, powered off the same line-side circuit, and if the phone was dead because the line was broken somewhere south of me, then the break was between here and Williams, and nothing I did here would reach them. But if the break was north of me, between here and the rim, I didn't have time to reason it all the way through. I had maybe 2 minutes left, so I did the only thing a maintenance man can do with a deadline and a live relay and no time. I short-circuited it. I took the 2 leads off the relay, and I crossed them, bare copper to bare copper, and I held them. And I hoped that somewhere 30 miles south in a dark dispatch shack, a light that hadn't lit in months would flicker, or a bell would ring, or something, anything, would tell a living person that a deadline had just come alive. I held those wires and I counted. And one of the gray at the base of the tower turned its head toward the sound of the arcing copper and started toward me. I held the wires. I'll tell you the truth. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the 41 people anymore. And I wasn't thinking about Stane. And I wasn't even thinking about my daughter in Flagstaff, who hadn't answered in 9 days. I was thinking about Delph's hand on my arm, and the 5 minutes I'd promised him, and how they were almost gone, and how if I let go of these wires, I'd have crossed all that open ground for nothing, and if I held them 1 second too long, the gray would reach me, and it would all be for nothing anyway. I held them until the thing was 10 yards out, and then I let go, and I ran. I don't remember the run back. My body did it without me. I remember the tower legs going past, and the gravel, and Delph's face in the cab window lit by the last purple light, and his hand out, and the grab iron. And then I was on the step, and the train was already moving, because Delph had started her rolling the instant he saw me break for it. And I fell into the vestibule, and lay there, with my chest heaving, while the water tower and its 8 gray shapes fell away behind us into the dark. "Did it connect?" Delph called back. I couldn't answer for a minute. When I could, I told him the truth. I don't know. The line was dead. I shorted the relay. Either somebody down there saw a light I can't see from here, or I crossed those wires for nothing. I don't know, Delph. I don't know. And that was the worst of it. We had thrown everything at the one chance we had, and we would not find out whether it worked until we came around the last curve at Williams and saw whether the gate was open or shut. There was no way to know. We had done the thing, and now we had to run 60 more minutes in the dark toward an answer we couldn't see coming. If you've made it this far with me, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing there are people out there in the dark with us, because that last hour of track was the loneliest stretch of my whole life. The last hour was full dark, and full dark on that line, that night, was a different world. We ran with the headlamp off. That was Delph's call, and it was the right one. A headlamp in the dark on that grassland is a beacon that pulls the gray from a mile in every direction. And we had 30 more miles to run, and no interest in dragging a following crowd all the way down to the Williams gate. So Delph ran her by memory and by the faint shape of the rails in the starlight, and by my voice at his shoulder calling the line from 20 years of walking it. Curve left in a quarter mile, cut coming, watch the crosswind, cattle guard, don't let the sound spook you. I called that whole stretch blind, and he ran it blind, and between us we made a train disappear into the dark of northern Arizona like a ghost of itself. The passengers had gone quiet. Real quiet, the quiet of people who have understood, without being told, that the next part is the part that matters. Old Bertram had gotten them to turn off every light in the cars, even the little emergency ones, because I'd asked him to. And 41 people sat in absolute darkness and absolute silence and trusted 2 men they'd met that afternoon to bring them home. I have never in my life felt a weight like that. It's a strange thing, to be trusted that completely by people who have no other choice. And here is the midpoint of it. The thing that turned the whole night over one more time. Because a story like this never lets you keep a plan for long. About 10 miles out from Williams, running dark, Delph slowed and then stopped the train. Just stopped it, dead on the line, and killed even the faint glow of the cab gauges. "Delph, what?" "Listen," he said. I listened. And under the tick of the cooling brakes and the wind in the grass, I heard it. A low, layered sound off to the south and west, ahead of us and to the right, the direction of Williams. The sound I'd heard before and would have given anything not to hear again. The sound of the gray in numbers. Not 8 of them drifting around a water tower. Many. A great slow tide of that sound, coming from exactly the place we were running toward. "The perimeter," Delph said. Something drew them to the Williams perimeter. A lot of them. We sat there in the dark and worked it out together. Quiet. The way we worked everything out. If a great mass of the gray had gathered at the Williams fence line, then one of 2 things was true, and both of them were bad. Either the guard was already fighting for its life down there, and the gate would never open for us, because they couldn't spare a hand or a second. Or the sound we were hearing meant the perimeter had already been drawn open, breached, something, and there was no safe yard left to run into at all. And there was a third possibility that neither of us wanted to say, which was that the thing that had drawn all those gray to the Williams fence line in the dark was the very light I'd tried to send down the copper wire. That somewhere in the dispatch shack, my shorted relay had lit a beacon or rung a bell, and it had woken not the guard, but the dead, and I had called a tide of the gray down onto the only safe place left, and led 41 people straight toward it. I have carried that possibility ever since. I want you to understand that. Even now, I do not know whether the thing I did at the water tower saved us or damned us. And I have made my peace with the not knowing about as well as a man can, which is to say not at all. "We can't run in blind," Delph said. "Not toward that. If the gates open and the yards overrun, we roll a train full of people into a killing floor. If it's shut, we sit outside it in the dark, with all of them, and no way in." He was quiet a moment. "There's a third way. Anita siding, 6 miles out. There's a spur, an old passing loop with a set of points. We could take the siding, hold there off the main line, and I go ahead on foot the last 6 miles to see with my own eyes what's happening at that gate before we commit 41 people to it. You go on foot, 6 miles, in the dark, through that." I gestured at the sound. "I know the grassland north of the yard better than anybody left alive," he said. And it was true. He'd grown up on that land. He'd told me so once. "I can move through it in the dark. You keep the train dark on the siding, and you keep these people alive and quiet. And if I'm not back by first light, you take the train in yourself at dawn, when the gate protocol resets, and you use your own judgment on what you find." He looked at me. "It's the same deal you gave me at the water tower, Pike. One of us goes and looks, so the other one doesn't drive 41 people off a cliff blind. You did it for them. Let me do it now." I didn't want to let him go. I'll be honest about that. Somewhere in that long, dark hour, Delph Cassaway had become the last person on Earth I trusted completely. The one man who'd told me the truth when a lie was in my ear. And every part of me wanted to keep him in that cab where I could see him. But he was right. And the arithmetic was the arithmetic. Miles, In the dark, through that. I gestured at the sound. I know the grassland north of the yard better than anybody left alive, he said. And it was true. He'd grown up on that land. He'd told me so once. I can move through it in the dark. You keep the train dark on the siding, and you keep these people alive and quiet. And if I'm not back by first light, you take the train in yourself at dawn, when the gate protocol resets, and you use your own judgment on what you find. He looked at me. It's the same deal you gave me at the water tower, Pike. One of us goes and looks, so the other one doesn't drive 41 people off a cliff blind. You did it for them. Let me do it now. I didn't want to let him go. I'll be honest about that. Somewhere in that long, dark hour, Delph Cassaway had become the last person on Earth I trusted completely. The one man who told me the truth when a lie was in my ear. And every part of me wanted to keep him in that cab where I could see him. But he was right. And the arithmetic was the arithmetic. And this is the thing nobody tells you about surviving a collapse. It is made almost entirely of moments where the right choice is the one that takes away the thing you most want to keep. We ran the train onto the Anita siding in the dark. I threw the points myself, by hand, the old iron lever cold and stiff. And Delph eased the consist off the main line and onto the passing loop, and brought her to a stop tucked behind a low rise that would hide her shape from the yard. We killed everything. 41 people in the dark, on a dead-end spur, 6 miles from a gate we couldn't see, and a tide of the gray somewhere ahead in the black. Delph climbed down. Before he went, he pressed something into my hand, his headcount card, the one he'd handed me on the platform a lifetime ago, folded now around something small and hard. If I don't come back, he said, there's a name and an address in Winslow written inside. My daughter. If any of you get out, and you ever get the chance. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. I'd been carrying the same unfinished sentence about Flagstaff for 9 days. You'll come back, I said, and you'll deliver it yourself. Watch your left, he said one more time, and then Delph Cassaway walked off the siding into the dark grassland toward the sound of the gray, and I climbed back up into the cab of a train full of silent, frightened people. And I began the longest wait of my life. Here is what waiting is, in the dark, on a dead siding, with 41 lives in your hands and your only friend gone into the black. It is listening. It is sitting in the driver's seat with the window cracked an inch so you can hear, and separating every sound into 2 piles. Things that are the night, and things that are coming for you. The wind in the grass, the tick of the metal, the far low tide of the gray at the Williams fence, rising and falling. And under all of it, straining. The sound you're actually listening for, which is a man's footsteps coming back, or a man's voice, or the absence of both. An hour went by, maybe more. I couldn't check a watch in the dark, and I wasn't going to strike a light. Twice in that hour, the gray came near the siding. Once a pair of them drifted along the rise, not 40 feet from the last car, and I sat frozen in the cab with my hand over my own mouth. And I heard, through the thin walls of the train, 41 people go so still and so silent that I could not have told you the train held anyone at all. Old Bertram had taught them well, or terror had. The 2 shapes drifted past and away, and I let myself breathe again. The second time it was a single one that came right up alongside the locomotive and stood there, close enough that I could hear it, that wet clicking breath they have. And it put one hand flat against the steel of the cab, right below my window. And it stood like that for what felt like an hour, and was probably a minute. And then it moved on. I did not breathe the whole time. I have never in my life been so aware of the thinness of a sheet of steel. And in that hour, in that dark, I finally understood the whole of what Errol Stane had done. And the understanding was worse than the fear. He hadn't just wanted a seat out. If all he'd wanted was to live, so aware of the thinness of a sheet of steel. And in that hour, in that dark, I finally understood the whole of what Errol Stane had done. And the understanding was worse than the fear. He hadn't just wanted a seat out. If all he'd wanted was to live, he could have simply ridden the train down with the rest of us, medic's privilege, and taken his chances at Williams like everyone else. He hadn't done that. He'd stayed on the rim. He'd chosen the dead end. And that was the piece that had confused me until, sitting in that dark cab, it finally came clear. Stane didn't believe Williams was safe. That was the whole key to the man. Somewhere in those 3 weeks of learning everything, of listening to every radio call, Stane had come to believe that the guard perimeter at Williams was going to fall. And soon, and that the trains weren't running people to safety at all. They were running them into a trap that just hadn't sprung yet. He'd done his own arithmetic on Williams, and decided the rim, dead end though it was, would outlast the yard. And he'd wanted the last train sabotaged, not to escape on it, but to make sure that when Williams fell, understood the whole of what Errol Stane had done. And the understanding was worse than the fear. He hadn't just wanted a seat out. If all he'd wanted was to live, he could have simply ridden the train down with the rest of us, medic's privilege, and taken his chances at Williams like everyone else. He hadn't done that. He'd stayed on the rim. He'd chosen the dead end. And that was the piece that had confused me until, sitting in that dark cab, it finally came clear. Stane didn't believe Williams was safe. That was the whole key to the man. Somewhere in those 3 weeks of learning everything, of listening to every radio call, Stane had come to believe that the guard perimeter at Williams was going to fall. And soon, and that the trains weren't running people to safety at all. They were running them into a trap that just hadn't sprung yet. He'd done his own arithmetic on Williams, and decided the rim, dead end though it was, would outlast the yard. And he'd wanted the last train sabotaged, not to escape on it, but to make sure that when Williams fell, the panic and the demand for evacuation didn't put him back onto a train headed for the wrong place. He'd broken the machine that led to Williams because he'd decided Williams was death. And now I was sitting 6 miles from Williams in the dark, listening to a tide of the gray at its fence line. And I could no longer be sure the man who'd betrayed us all had been wrong. That is the cruelest thing a traitor can leave you with, not the injury, the doubt. Stane had made me wonder, in the dark on that siding, whether the thing I'd fought so hard to reach, the gate, the yard, the perimeter, the whole promise of Williams, was worth reaching at all. Whether Delph had walked off into the black toward a place already lost. Whether the right thing, the thing I'd risked everything for, was leading 41 people to exactly the death Stane had foreseen. I want to ask you something here, honestly. And I want you to sit with it the way I had to sit with it in that cab. If you'd been me, if the man who betrayed you had also, maybe, been the only one who saw the truth, would you still have run for that gate? Or would you have believed him and turned the train around and gone back to the dead end that might just outlast the world? Tell me, because I made my choice, and I've never been at peace with it. And I'd truly like to know what you would have done. Delph came back at the very edge of first light. I heard him before I saw him, and my whole body went cold before I understood why, because the footsteps in the grass were wrong. Too fast. A man running. And a man running in that grassland in the dark was a man being followed. I had my hand on the throttle before I'd thought about it, ready to roll the train off the siding and abandon him if it came to that, because I'd made him the same promise he'd made me, and a promise like that goes both ways. But it was Delph, and he was alone. And he wasn't running from the gray. He was running because of what he'd seen. He came up the ladder into the cab, gasping, and he grabbed my arm with both hands, and in the gray pre-dawn light, I could finally see his face. And it was lit up with something I hadn't seen on anyone's face in 6 weeks. "The gate's open," he said. "Pike, the gate is open and it's holding." And then he told me the rest of it, all in a rush. And the whole night turned over one final time. The tide of the gray we'd heard at the Williams fence line, it wasn't the perimeter falling. It was the opposite. The guard down at Williams had gotten my signal. My shorted relay in that deadline side box had, against every odds I'd have given it, lit an old block signal indicator in the dispatch shack. And there had been a man near enough to see it. A signalman old enough to know what a live indicator on a deadline meant. A train, somewhere up the line, trying to reach them. And the guard, not knowing where we were or when we'd come, but knowing we were coming, had done the bravest thing I've ever heard of. They'd opened the gate early, and they'd used the open gate and their lights and their noise deliberately, drawing the gray away from the receiving platform and down along the fence line to the far side, herding that whole tide to the south so that the northern approach, the approach a train would take, would be clear. The sound we'd heard wasn't a perimeter dying. It was a perimeter fighting to hold a door open for us in the dark. On nothing but the faith that a flickering light meant we were out here somewhere. They'd been holding it open all night. 6 extra hours, way past every safe protocol, burning through everything they had. Because they didn't know if or when we'd come, and they would not be the ones to close the door on a train full of people. Sergeant Okonkwo's counterpart down there, a guard lieutenant whose name Delph never learned, had made a call that I'll be grateful for until the day I die. Hold the gate. Hold it past dark. Hold it past sense. Hold it on the chance that somebody's still out there in the black trying to get home. Stane had been wrong. That was the thing that broke over me in the gray dawn light in that cab. Stane had done his cold arithmetic and decided the yard would fall and the rim would outlast it. And he'd sabotaged the train and marooned 200 people and nearly killed 41 more on the strength of that calculation. And he'd been wrong. Williams held all night in the dark on nothing but the decency of strangers who wouldn't close a door. The traitor's whole justification, the doubt he'd planted in me on that siding, the thing that had nearly made me turn the train around. It was wrong. The safest thing to do had also been the right thing to do. And I had very nearly let a dead man's cynicism talk me out of it. We ran the last 6 miles in the first light of morning. Delph brought her off the siding, and I threw the points back and climbed aboard. And we ran that consist down the final grade into the Williams yard, with the sun just clearing the ponderosas and turning the whole world gold and ordinary. The gate was open, exactly as he'd said. And I could see the guard along the fence line to the south still holding the gray off. And I could see the receiving platform clear and men waving us in. And behind me, through the whole length of the train, I heard 41 people begin to understand that they were going to live. And the sound they made was not a cheer. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of people who'd been holding their breath for 2 hours, finally letting it go, altogether. And it is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, and I hope I never hear anything like it again. We came into the platform, and Delph brought her to a stop, as gentle as he'd stopped every train in his life. So gentle you'd hardly feel it. And the doors opened, and it was over. Except it wasn't over. Not really. And I want to tell you the truth about the end of it. Because a true story doesn't get to tie itself up clean. 41 people walked off that train into the Williams yard alive. Corinne Vasquez and her grandson Teo, who slept through the grade and woke asking if we were there yet, and who now was. Old Bertram Ochoa, who kept a whole car of strangers calm in the dark with his teacher's voice. The young couple who never let go of each other's hands. Every one of them, 41 seats that Errol Stane had done his arithmetic on and decided were worth less than his guarantee. And all 41 of them walked off that train into the morning sun. And 200 people on the South Rim did not. That's the part I carry. The train never went back. It couldn't. By the time we understood what Stane had done and what it had cost, the rim was gone overrun the next day. The gray finally cresting the platform the way we'd always feared. And no train came for them, because the last tour train had left the Grand Canyon without a driver, exactly as Stane intended. And there was no bringing it back up that grade in time. Ruth Anchetta, the woman who'd told me I was the driver and trusted a rusty old man over a good one who might turn, I never learned what happened to her. She was up there when it fell. She got 200 people 6 weeks further than anyone had a right to. And then the arithmetic that Stane had rigged came due, and I was 65 miles away and could do nothing but stand in the Williams yard and understand it. As for Stane himself, I don't know. That's the truth, and I know it's not the ending you want. He was on the rim when it fell. Maybe the gray took him. Maybe a man that good at surviving found one more way out. A man who could walk into a backpacking group a stranger and walk out its only survivor is not a man who dies easily. I have imagined, some nights, that he made it. That somewhere out there is a soft-voiced man with careful hands and another dead man's name, walking into some other frightened group, remembering their wives' names, being indispensable, doing his cold arithmetic on who's worth a seat. I hope that isn't so. But I've stopped pretending I know. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. Delph handed me his headcount card on that platform, with his daughter's name in Winslow folded inside it, because he thought he might not come back. He came back. And 2 months later, when the roads down south opened up enough to try, the two of us drove to Winslow together. And we found her. And she was alive. And I stood in a stranger's yard and watched my friend hold his daughter, and I thought about the fact that I still hadn't reached mine. In Flagstaff. That's a separate story and not one for tonight. But I'll tell you what Delph said to me, driving back from Winslow, when I finally said out loud the thing that had been eating me, that Stane might have been right, that Williams might still fall, that maybe I'd just delayed 41 deaths and doomed 200 more for nothing. Delph was quiet for a long while, the way he always was. And then he said, Stane did his arithmetic on people, figured out exactly what everybody was worth and made his moves. And the whole time he was doing his sums, a lieutenant down at Williams, who never met a one of us, held a gate open all night on the chance we were out there. You can't do arithmetic on that, Pike. That's the number that's not in his math. That's why he was wrong. He watched the road. Men like Stane always leave that number out. That's the only reason the rest of us are still here. I've thought about that more than almost anything. So that's the story of the last tour train that left the Grand Canyon without a driver. I've told it to you as plain and true as I can. And I want to leave you with the question I've never been able to answer for myself, because I think it's yours now as much as mine. If Stane had been standing there on the Williams platform when we came in, if the gray hadn't taken the rim, and he'd somehow made it down, and I'd come face to face with the man who marooned 200 people and nearly killed 41, and planted a doubt in me that nearly turned the train around, what would I have done? What should I have done? Because I know what I'd have felt. But I've been a railway man my whole life. A man who fixes things and keeps them running, not a man who breaks them. And I don't honestly know that I have it in me to be his judge, even for that. So I'm asking you, not to be cruel and not to be soft, but honestly, what would you have done with a man like Errol Stane? Would you have handed him to the guard, turned your back and walked away? Something worse? Tell me, down below, and tell me why, because I've turned it over 1,000 nights, and I still don't know. And I've come to think the answer says more about the person answering than it ever could about Stane. Thank you for riding the whole way down with me. It was a long, dark stretch of track, and I was glad of the company. If stories like this are the kind you come here for, you know where to find us, and I'll have another one for you soon. Watch your left.